Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author, and PhD in Spanish and French literature. Those of you who are tuning in today are witnessing a little bit of Foxed Page history. We are diving in today into our very first horror novel. Of course, the one that we have to do this with is obviously Stephen King. I always like to begin with this question of why we are reading a certain book. The idea of Carrie and Stephen King came to me because, in fact, it is the 50th anniversary of the publication of Carrie. I am someone who does not read a lot of genre fiction, and that sounds snobby, and in fact, it is a little snobby. I'm going to just own that. But I also am going to say that what I read for in everything that I read is really language. I'm really reading for language, not so much for plot, not so much for theme or message, and certainly not to be afraid. I did some deep diving, which we're going to get to, but it turns out if you're someone who is very sensitive, I am actually an HSP, a highly sensitive person. If you are a highly sensitive person and you are also very empathetic, turns out maybe the horror genre is not for you. But I will say that many, many moons ago, I read Bag of Bones by Stephen King. I am not sure that anyone would say that Bag of Bones is like their favorite Stephen King novel. I don't know, maybe there's some people out there. It's the only one I read and I loved it. I didn't quite love it enough to read more, but I was so pleased because the prose was excellent. I was totally caught up in the plot in a way that was sort of unusual for me, and I just really enjoyed the entire book. I had to redo some of my thinking about Stephen King as a prose stylist because, in fact, he has some real literary chops, and the book was just very, it was very interesting. It really moved right along, but also I found a lot of the prose very beautiful. So I was very happy about the idea of going back and taking a look at Carrie, which is in fact his very first published novel. I'm also interested in the idea of looking at the horror genre as a whole. We're going to talk today a bit about why it is that people like to be scared. And we did this when we talked about Agatha Christie. We talked about the idea of the mystery genre as being sort of inherently corrective of society, like having kind of a moral weight. And horror actually serves a lot of those same purposes. And I really wanted to take a look at that. I was also just really excited about the idea of digging in to this sort of cultural phenomenon that happened when I was 4 years old that I missed entirely. I did not watch the movie Carrie, and I didn't actually, ever in my life, but I did recently watch a documentary about it that was so interesting, the making of Carrie. I had no idea that it won a whole bunch of Academy Awards and that Brian De Palma, was feted as someone who was really putting that type of horror movie kind of on the map in many ways. The only horror movie I ever watched was The Exorcist. I was in 7th grade. I was spending the night at my friend Shelley Richter's house. It was on television, and honestly, it scarred me forever. Probably a decade from 7th grade until I don't even know, probably early college. I was totally convinced at different points that I was being possessed by a devil. My leg would twitch and I'd be like, oh God, here we go. Literally oh God, here we go. So I just, The Exorcist did it for me. I did not sleep well. I just had a really sort of dark moment. And I decided at that point that in fact, no horror movies were going to be good for me. Even the little snippets that I saw during the documentary about Carrie, I was like, yeah, probably a good idea for me not to ever have seen this movie. And in fact, lots of ways that movie was sort of camp. But wow, Sissy Spacek, amazing job in that film. But so I really was interested in the idea of looking at the literature. I'm also interested in the way that watching something, for me, the idea of having a visual impression of it is much scarier and much more sort of terrible. I'm a deep reader. And so you would think that reading about scary things would be scary for me, when in fact it is not. Watching them, on the other hand, is horrifying and something that I choose not to do. Okay. For those of you who like an agenda, here is your agenda. First, we're going to talk a little bit about horror, why it is that we like to be scared, why it is somewhat sort of morally corrective as a genre. We're going to talk about the biography very briefly of Stephen King. We're going to dive in to the first few pages of the text, which are amazing. Then we're going to talk about the structure. The structure of the novel is novel Actually, I found it really innovative and super interesting. So we're going to talk a little bit about not only what the structure is, but the purpose that it in fact serves. We're going to take a look at the incredible narrative voice. I mean, this is really Stephen King just really like maxing out the idea of a narrative voice. It's so incredible to think that this was his very first novel, because this is a very deft, very telling, very skilled narrative stance. Very sophisticated in lots of ways. We're going to talk about the community of New England. That is a community I have spent some time in, having gone to school in New Hampshire at Dartmouth College. Gained a pretty good appreciation. Also, in fact, being married to someone who is from Massachusetts, it was a very interesting look at New England as a region. And I think that King really positions a lot of his work very firmly in Maine and in New England. And in lots of ways, it feels to me like a very sort of New England body of work. We're going to look at the way that his fiction is working class. We're going to look at the role of religion. And we are going to look at the witchiness. There's a lot of witchiness in Carrie, and in fact, in a lot of Stephen King. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to touch on why the prose is so excellent, and we're going to look at one very weird example of why I think the prose is so good. And then as we are moving along, of course, we will be talking about some of the casual racism, which is not great in Carrie. We're going to talk about the feminist thrust of the novel, which is really impressive. We're going to talk here and there about some things that even Stephen King, I think, might have revised if he had the chance to do the book over. Some of that is coming from the fact that he wrote a book called On Writing in the year 2000, so more than 25 years after Carrie was published. And even then, I think he has seen the light where adverbs are concerned. And then we will talk about the close of the novel. So why is it that we like to read horror stories? And why is it, in fact, that horror fiction is way up? Apparently, especially, there's some sort of movement on Book Talk, which is that vein of TikTok that has to do with writing, which is excellent. Apparently, there's a lot of promotion there of both fantasy and of horror as a genre, which is great. So the number of people who are reading horror books has actually gone up significantly. So a couple of different things. There's a lot of scholarly work on this topic. One of the papers that I read was out of Johns Hopkins, and it was by a guy who is he's in the business school, but he's like some sort of behavioral scientist. His name is Haiyang Yang, and he talks about how one of the reasons we like to read horror is because it allows us a safe place from which we can explore the dark side of humanity, which I really liked that idea. And I would add to that, in fact, the idea that it is giving us a space to really think about some of the dark issues of the day. So when we're talking about the dark, side of humanity, we're also talking about all the sort of dark things that humanity has wrought. So, for example, climate change, racism, social stratification, underdogs, all of that is sort of, it is in fact the dark side of humanity. And it's really an interesting sort of building block upon which to think about all the many ways in which the dark side of humanity is endlessly fascinating. So there also is, of course, a certain amount of adrenaline that results from being scared. I did not actually find Carrie particularly scary. There were no parts. There were some parts where I was kind of grossed out, but I was not ever afraid, which is an interesting thing. And certainly you don't have the same sort of jump scare thing that you have when you are watching a horror film, which is probably why I like the safety of the book so much more. So that safety, it turns out, is crucial. One of the main reasons why we like to watch horror films and read horror novels is the fact that we are doing so from a place of safety. So he talks about these safety frames that people have to have. And one is that you need some reminders about things not being real. And again, I'm not a big watcher of horror films, but I know that there's a whole, genre of horror films that are very sort of campy. And I think that a lot of those reminders, some of the kind of over-the-top goriness are reminders, in fact, that what we are watching is not real. Whereas, for example, something like The Exorcist just scared the shit out of me because, in fact, there was not a lot in there that couldn't have been real. I mean, that's kind of a stretch to say, but like my 12-year-old self was really, hook, line, and sinker. That is actually another part of what we love about horror films is they allow us to go beyond the realistic. And that sounds very sort of basic, but we've talked a lot at the Fox page about realist literature. And certainly horror, which, Gothic literature, so think of Dracula and Frankenstein and that kind of 19th century novel where we are talking about death and we are talking about ghosts and we are talking about spirits and crossing over into other realms, or drinking other people's blood and becoming immortal. All of those are explorations of the human condition, this idea that we will at one point die, and in fact we don't know when that's going to happen. We don't know what happens when we do die. All of those enormous questions are really excellent fodder for something like the horror genre because, in fact, it allows us to go beyond the realist novel. It's a bit like fantasy, but fantasy plus a whole lot of darkness. We also really need to have a sense of control when we are reading. So one very good example of this is that my eldest son was a real reader, and he read Roald Dahl's BFG, The Big Friendly Giant, and was absolutely horrified. And so my parents live about 10 minutes away from us, and so we had to drive over and leave the book at my parents' house. He didn't want to throw it away, which probably was a superstitious thing for him, or recycle it or whatever. So he felt okay about it being over at my parents' house. The other kind of universal example of this is when in Friends, the television show, when Joey reads The Shining, in fact, by Stephen King, and he is so afraid that he needs to put it, I think, in the freezer, I think is where that book ends up. So this idea of having things be controllable is very, very important. So if you're watching a film, we're watching some sort of horror movie, you can always stop the movie. You can always get up and leave the room. You can always close your eyes. You can put your, hands over your eyes. You can shut the book. So this idea of having control is, in fact, very important. So it will not be a surprise that people who are thrill seekers, people who really like a lot of adrenaline, seem to like these movies more than other people. And in fact, those who are highly empathetic or highly sensitive, like myself, in fact, are perhaps not great candidates for a lot of horror movie watching. Again, I find it interesting that I don't have a hard time reading this. The only book that scared me so much that I couldn't finish it was White Noise by Don DeLillo. And I'm kind of interested in why that was. I should probably revisit it, but honestly, I'm just a little bit afraid. And I love Don DeLillo, but that one really, I won't even watch the movie. There's a great movie with Adam Driver, and I'm like, no, thank you. Okay. The last thing I will say about why these movies and books are appealing to us is often we have some sort of a conclusion that allows us to feel like we have triumphed over ill. And at the end of the movie, something is exorcised and everybody's okay again, that sort of thing. Often, this is my own self kind of riffing here, I feel like there's always that moment at the end of a horror film where there's a little nod toward the fact that things, in fact, are not settled. There's always that idea that this phenomenon that has been explored in the movie is going to continue, or that, there's a little indication, in fact, that the ghost has not, been forever dissipated. So I'm interested in this idea of the way that the genre both provides some sort of conclusion that is reassuring, but is also, I think, very invested in this idea of leaving you with a little sense of being afraid. And then the final thing I will say about this is I am very interested in this idea of it being, of the genre, as being sort of corrective or having some sort of moral freight. So lots of times when you think about these, the victim is in fact a victim in the sense that they are often innocent. And lots of times, not in the case of The Exorcist, but for example, in the case of Carrie, we have a villain. Apparently there's a lot of politics. Again, I don't know the genre well enough to know this. There's something called the last girl, which is there's always one last girl. And I would imagine that if we take a look at that, whoever is surviving, the sort of onslaught of zombies or whatever it is, I would imagine that usually the person who is being promoted is not a total dick. Usually, the person who's going to survive and who has sort of withstood all of the challenges is in fact going to be a person we can all get behind. So in many ways, it's providing a moral. It's a story with a certain amount of a moral, and definitely Carrie, conforms to that idea of the bad guys are bad and they are avenged at the end. I mean, Carrie also does not fare well in the novel, which is, she just is kind of the victim. But we're going to talk about this more. But Sue Snell, who is the person in the novel from, almost the beginning, has a decent amount of sort of compunction, and she's feeling badly about what has gone on, and she's trying to make things better. She, in fact, is someone who does survive, and she is someone who is able to sort of, come out of this not on top, but come out like not even unscathed. What am I saying? I mean, life is not great for Sue Snell. But there is this idea of her as, the person who's doing the good thing is the person who, in fact, ends up enduring. Now that we've discussed horror and why it is that we are drawn to this genre, we're going to talk about a very quick biography of Stephen King. He was born Stephen Edwin King in 1947 and is known as the King of Horror. I mean, I think, which is a cute little play on his last name, of course. But he is someone who is renowned. He has won lots and lots of prizes and is just incredibly prolific. Very famously, actually, he has had a lot of drug issues. He is now sober. In fact, his book On Writing, which was written in the year 2000 or published in 2000, is an absolutely incredible. I read that before I actually read any of his fiction. It's just a really, really moving book about overcoming difficulties. And certainly his addiction to drugs was a huge source of difficulty. He talks about being just totally loaded at different points in time and, sort of operating in a way that was like somewhat acceptable. But he does admit that like the entire novel of Cujo, he has like no memory whatsoever of writing that book because, in fact, he was so loaded the whole time. So King was born in Portland, Maine, and his father left the family when Stephen was 2 years old. Stephen has an older brother named David and a single mother who essentially raised him. And from everything that I have heard in interviews and what I remember from On Writing, he grew up in a pretty serious situation of poverty. They didn't have a television, which he actually thinks was very, very good for him. He was an absolutely voracious reader. He started out by copying comic books and then making up his own stories. He loved a lot of mystery things, so Nancy Drew, H.P. Lovecraft. A librarian once, or some sort of bookmobile woman at one point, gave him a copy of Lord of the Flies, which made a very large impact on him. You can see an echo of Lord of the Flies, certainly in Carrie, but I imagine in lots and lots of his work. His older brother, David, had a newspaper when they were in high school that Stephen King did a lot of writing for. He also was a reporter for a weekly newspaper. And you see this idea of both the, the news wires, the AP, and these small magazines and small and larger magazines. We have references to The Atlantic and Life and all of these different magazines in Carrie. But he worked for a very small regional newspaper, and you see that sort of publication also included in Carrie. Everyone I read who has any kind of experience as a journalist, it really always seems like they learn a huge amount. I mean, Joan Didion, she wrote for Vogue when she was first starting out and had to distill things in order to have them be captions. And she talks about that process of distillation as really being very impactful. And you can imagine Stephen King, following that very journalistic, sort of formula where you have a first paragraph that's the hook, that's very colorful and grabs the reader. And then the second paragraph is the nut graph where you have like the actual story and then developing it logically from there. His writing is very suited to that. And in fact, it is very gripping. And then he also has this very excellent use of expository writing, which you can see as having come from his experience as a journalist. He met Tabitha Spruce, his wife, Tabby, at a writing seminar, and they have 3 children. He's been interviewed widely, and you can see lots of this on YouTube. And recently, Margaret Atwood and some other writers had an excellent sort of long-form piece in the book review of the New York Times on the occasion of Carrie's 50th anniversary. But he talks a lot about starting with this idea of what if. But he also talked, and I really like this, about the intrusion of the extraordinary into ordinary life. And if for examples of that, he provided like you get a diagnosis of cancer or you have a prank call that then ends up having a bunch of repercussions. So this idea of something extraordinary happening in your ordinary life. And then the real question for him is how we handle it. So I like the idea of starting at these very basic points and the emphasis on ordinary life. It does feel to me like it's all very grounded in this kind of, very relatable and, in fact, in lots of ways, very realistic kinds of portrayals of life. And I think that makes it even more harrowing when, in fact, these extraordinary events begin happening. We are now going to dive into the text. I have to say that I was kind of delighted that my local independent bookstore, this was like, one of the very few like little airport looking kind of novels. I think we used to call these airport novels. Now at the airport, there's usually some nice bougie, bookstore that has like all sorts of different things. I don't have any other book that is this dimension. I went on my honeymoon and I had like a huge stack of books, and someone was like, you can't take all those books with you on your honeymoon. And I was young and impressionable, and I was like, oh God, okay. And of course I finished all of my books in like all my like 3 books that I brought in like 1 second. So at the hotel like gift shop, they had a lot of Pat Conroy. And so I read like Prince of Tides, and I read all of these Pat Conroy novels they had, and I loved them. And they were all this size. So Stephen King talks a lot about how Carrie is so short. It's how it's very tiny. And in fact, it is quick. I mean, to be honest, I read it in one day. I read it and listened to it at the same time. It's I listened to an audio version that has Sissy Spacek reading it, and I really liked the echo of, Carrie from the movie as reading it, but I was a little distracted because, she's got this kind of Southern accent happening, and when in fact this is like a very New England thing. And I kept kind of wishing that these different sort of people who were voicing these different, that when she was being Sue Snell or when she was being Tommy or Billy or any of these people, that we had a little bit more of a New England thing. We should get like Ben Affleck or like Mark Wahlberg or somebody to do this. Okay, but back to the text at hand. So he thinks of this as being not that long, but that is, I think, in comparison with books like The Stand or even The Shining, which are these big, huge, fat books. It is, in fact, I'm looking at it here, it's 287 pages. So it's not super short, but this format really makes you feel like you're just like zipping right through it because, in fact, it does clip right along. I want to talk, there's obviously been so many copies of this over the 50 years. Do I love this cover art? Not really. I love the Stephen King part. I actually really love the shiny metallic part of it. I love the Carrie font here. I'm not that wild about the like flower together with the skull thing, mostly because it doesn't seem very germane to me. This doesn't speak to me about what it is that we're going to find inside this volume, but it's fine. The title, on the other hand, I think is excellent. So I really like the idea of really focusing all of our attention on this young woman. You can imagine if it were called something different, if it were called Prom Night or Bloodsport, which those are chapter titles. If it were called one of those other things, it would be very much about the community or about the actions or about the plot or some other element. But here we are having this girl, this young woman who is, having her first sort of entree into puberty and really becoming a woman, coming into her womanhood. She is very much at the center of the book. And that's something that's very important, and it's going to come up again and again today, which is the fact that in 1974, Stephen King is responding, certainly, we see different elements of it in the novel, he is responding to the fact that this is, the second wave of feminism in America is really making itself felt. So if you have all the hippie stuff happening in the 60s, by the time the 70s are rolling in, there's a lot more, consciousness around male chauvinism and around the ways that women are wronged and on, the necessity for more equality between the sexes. All of that sort of stuff is, in fact, here in Carrie. And I really like the way that the title of the book is alerting us to the fact that there is a female at the center of the whole thing. It's also interesting to me that her name, it's not from Catherine or Carolyn or Kathleen. It comes from Carrietta. And that made me think in part of the sort of immigrant sort of status. So throughout the book, the last names are so interesting. You have, Thibodeau, or maybe they say Thibodeau, That's a regional kind of pronunciation thing. You have words, you have last names that sound Irish, some that sound Italian, some that sound French. You have this real sense of an immigrant population that is being all sort of, mushed together. But Carrietta, to me, has this very sort of Italian thing, the way that it is spelled. And so I think there's, and her last name, of course, is White. And the white-black thing, we're not going to dig too deeply into that. It started to get a little problematic for me because there was a little bit of this sort of typical, black things are bad and white things are good. And I just can't quite get over the racist overtones of that. But it is something that we should for sure be acknowledging. Importantly, her father's last name was Brigham. I think that's right. Or maybe her mother's maiden name was Brigham. I think that's correct. So you have this idea of religion, Brigham in my mind, really, bringing to mind the Church of Latter-day Saints and Mormonism. You have a very critical look at religion here. The woman who is so fanatically religious at the center of the novel, Carrie's mother, is really someone who is wielding religion in a really, really terrible, terrible way. So, and in fact, the utilization on the part of Stephen King using Brigham as her maiden name is very telling. I think it's a very sort of clear leveling of criticism at organized religion in general. But so we have Carrietta White, and this idea of carry is significant in its own. There's this idea of having to carry stuff, having to carry your burden. There's also an idea of care-y, do we care about her? Is anyone caring for her? Is she caring for herself? All of these questions about care are really sort of, at the front of our minds. All of which I think is excellent. I really, really like it as a title. It also, to me, it sounds very of the moment. I don't hear a lot of Carries these days. I don't know a lot of 25-year-old Carries, but there certainly were a lot. It was right in there with all the Kimberlys and the Lindas and the Wendys and the Carries. We had, actually Carrie was a little later perhaps, but it was 1974 when Stephen King is using this name. And to me, it does really harken back to a certain era. So I really like the idea of the title. I think it's very rich. And mostly I like it because, in fact, it is, really focusing us on this woman who is at the heart of this. Also, you have the idea of caritas. So caritas or Carrietta, because of the Italian overtones, makes me think of the Latin part, which is caritas, which is care, or having cariño, having love for someone, or charity, that idea of caring for someone. So you have these kinds of overtones that I think Stephen King is really playing with very beautifully. I also really appreciate the kind of understated inclusion here on the cover of the idea that this is a #1 bestseller. This is a book that has, I think, never been out of print. It's hugely popular. It really is still considered one of his very best books. I think The Shining is for a lot of people, and The Stand. Those are both books that are really, in the forefront of the books that people think are sort of his best. Honestly, I feel like don't even need to repeat the story of the sort of origin of this novel, because it is something that is so storied, and he has mentioned many times, and it's in all of the different interviews, but I'm going to fill you in anyway, the quick version. So he, at the time, was writing for men's magazines and, Playboy and whatever, Hustler or something like that. And he was getting paid about $75 per short story or per article or whatever it was. And he talked a lot about, at that point, they had no telephone, he and Tabby, and they had 2 young kids, and there were constant ear infections. It turns out their eldest child had some health issues, and so it was very taxing to be impoverished and to be 2 writers together who were trying to have this family. And so he realized that what he was going to be writing was going to be too long to sell to the men's magazines. He crumples it up, throws it in the garbage can, and then apparently Tabby brushed off all the cigarette butts and took it out and read it and said, "I really think you should continue this." And he's like, "It's going to be too long." And she said, No, I think you should do it anyway. And then we have Carrie. So it's really an excellent origin story. Tabby, it turns out, has been incredibly supportive at every single turn. I also love her name. Some of you may remember that that is the name of my cat, Tabitha. And I really wish, I first wish that I had named my daughter Frances, but then after Frances, Tabitha. I think that would have been such a good name. Anyway, I love the idea of Tabitha King. So she's very supportive. They get the novel written. He gets the novel written while she's doing, a lot of other household stuff, I imagine, and doing her own writing. And when he sells it, they get a telegram, and he was teaching high school at the time, and Tabitha called him, and there was like some, over the loudspeaker at the school, like, Stephen King, come to the office for a call from your wife. And he goes, and in fact, they got an advance on the story for $2,500. And then, of course, the rest is history. And so the origin story is excellent, and I love how casual this reference to this being a #1 bestseller is on the front of the cover. Okay, so now we are going to dive into the actual text itself. So it is, in fact, dedicated to his wife. This is for Tabby, who got me into it and then bailed me out of it. And then we have part 1, blood sport. So I believe it's in On Writing, because that's really the only piece of nonfiction that I have read where he's talking about his own work. But he talks about recognizing that at very important points in different novels, he will notice the presence of something. It could be blood, it could be fire. I imagine that's from like Firestarter. But in this case, he recognized that blood was something that came up at sort of 2 different points, or maybe 3. And then in the sort of restructuring and the reworking of the story, he decided, in fact, to lean into that. And we do, in fact, have blood that is coming out literally at these different points. And so this idea of titling the part 1 blood sport is really beautiful, because it's kind of drawing our attention to the fact that blood is going to be an important aspect of the work. Okay, now we are going to dive in. I am so impressed with the opening of this novel. I have written down right here, pages 3 to 5. It is all here. We have an incredible narrative stance. We have this really interesting structure with all these kinds of different sources of evidence. We have a certain scientific bent at the start, and we have prose that is really just excellent. News item from the Westover, Maine Weekly Enterprise, August 19th, 1966. Rain of stones reported. It was reliably reported by several persons that a rain of stones fell from a clear blue sky on Carlin Street in the town of Chamberlain on August 17th. The stones fell principally on the home of Mrs. Margaret White, damaging the roof extensively and ruining 2 gutters and a downspout valued at approximately $25. Mrs. White, a widow, lives with her 3-year-old daughter, Carrietta. Mrs. White could not be reached for comment. So this is so good. Those of you who have been listening to the Fox page for a while know that one of the symbols that you can look out for as you are reading is the house. So if you come across a house or a garden in any kind of good literature, and this is that, you want to think of the house or the garden as sort of a metaphor for whatever is happening there. So whether it's for the family or, whether it's the group of people in the garden, whatever the thing is. If the garden is choked with weeds, that says something. If it's very orderly, that says another. In this case, the house, which at this point is called the home, we know that there's been this kind of very strange thing that is happening there. And in fact, this is a real understatement. We learn later what has actually happened and how sort of horrific that was in lots of ways. So right at the beginning, we have this idea of this widow and her daughter. And in fact, they are singled out from the rest of the community in ways that are very pointed. And we realize that this is the source of everything else that is going to happen. Okay, and then we continue on. Nobody was really surprised when it happened. Not really, not at the subconscious level where savage things grow. On the surface, all the girls in the shower room were shocked, thrilled, ashamed, or simply glad that the white bitch had taken it in the mouth again. So this is so important. Here, when we have at the beginning, we have this kind of news piece, and then that's set aside. It's different font. It's, clearly taken like as an excerpt. It's a piece of evidence, in fact. And then we have this omniscient narrator. Nobody was really surprised when it happened. So this is a narrator who is, assuming that we as readers have a certain amount of information, and that's very flattering. It's sort of like we are included in the community. It's, they're presupposing a certain level of information and knowledge on our part, which, as long as that information is given to us quickly, it can be very flattering. But this idea of nobody was surprised, you have this idea of an entire community. So the community is incredibly important. My mind is going straight to Lord of the Flies. The idea of humanity and the idea of people as working together, in both nefarious and beneficial ways. We have this idea of the community here as being like a very sort of Greek chorus kind of thing. And this omniscient narrator is really allowing for that. So again, this is an omniscient narrator. It's not, I did this and I did that. Although later we do have a first-person narrator, which we will talk about in a second. But this idea of nobody was really surprised, this is definitely an all-knowing narrator who's pulled way back, who's telling us about the entire community. It's really well done. It's also beautiful the way we have this kind of ominous and also very literary, image right at the very beginning here. Nobody was really surprised when it happened. Not really. Not at the subconscious level where savage things grow. So the idea of the subconscious level, we're talking about, the human mind. We are talking about a certain scientific bent here. We're talking about psychology. And then this idea of savage things growing. The idea of savagery really has everything to do with humanity sort of gone awry. So this idea here of and the growth of things, this kind of malignance that is happening, that is all of these different elements are introduced right at the start. And then, of course, we have the girls in the shower room. It's there was one interview that I read where somebody was saying that it's sort of odd that Stephen King would be writing about menstruation for a men's magazine, which actually, is all the more reason that he crumpled up the pages and threw them in the trash can. But I think it's very interesting that he would, in fact, be writing about all of these girls together and someone beginning menstruation. So I did a lot of thinking about this. And in 1973, when he would be writing this, he and Tabby got married, I believe, in 1970, and very quickly had both of their two eldest children. So you have Stephen King as newly married. He's someone who grew up with a single mother and a brother, but no sisters. He's newly married and he suddenly has a daughter. So I think he would be thinking a lot about women, even if it were not, at a very heightened moment for feminism in the United States. There would have been a lot of hope. There would have been a lot of expectation at that point that women, women's lib and the ERA and all of that kind of stuff was really going to come to pass. So I would think he would be doing a lot of thinking. He's living with Tabitha, who, we have to assume was menstruating when she wasn't pregnant. He recently saw the birth of his children. I mean, I think it would be a time when bodily functions would, in fact, have been sort of front and center. And also a time, if his daughter's 2-3 years old, when he would be thinking about, how she is going to fare. By the way, her name is Naomi King, and now they identify as genderqueer. But, as a very young child, I would imagine that King would be looking at her as a daughter and feeling all of the sorts of, weird protective things that fathers sometimes feel, certainly in New England, where there's a lot of shame around sexuality and a lot of weird, puritanical thinking about sex. There would be a certain amount of thinking about the reality of having a daughter. So all of that is included in the very beginning. And in fact, we have this omniscient narrator who is entering very quickly into this locker room scene. And it is very much this kind of Greek chorus thing. We have all of the young women, they're yelling. But the meanness, the cruelty in this group of people is evident right from the start. So you're kind of like, okay, I'm in the shower, I'm in the locker room with all of these young women. And then it's really kind of really hit me, this idea, all the girls in the shower room were shocked, thrilled, ashamed, or simply glad that the white bitch had taken it in the mouth again. I was like, oh my God, the white bitch, like what? Wow, seemed very mean to me. And I grew up in California, and certainly there was a lot of, bullying and a lot of like meanness. My husband always claims that kids now today are much, much nicer than they used to be, which I think is probably the case. He also convinced me that the kids in Massachusetts were way meaner than the kids in California. But this idea of being happy that the white bitch, that Carrie, who is, known here as a bitch, took it on the mouth. It's also this kind of violent and kind of strange description there, and very sort of male in lots of ways. Okay, and then we're going to jump down a little bit to the beginning of the next paragraph. What none of them knew, of course, was that Carrie White was telekinetic. So it's important here that we're using a scientific term, this idea of telekinetic, and it's not, that she could move things with her mind, or that she had a superpower, or that she, was possessed, or like however you want to think about that. So you have this idea of sort of dropping this scientific term at the beginning, and then very quickly we move on to more of this kind of ephemera that is one of the really striking aspects of the structure of the book. So the next, we have a space break, and then we have graffiti scratched on a desk of the Barker Street Grammar School in Chamberlain. Carrie White eats shit. I also was like, somebody rather eats shit. Like, I know that as like an insult, like eat shit, buddy, but not like Carrie White eats shit. I was like, I guess that's a thing that people used to say. That's not something that we used to say. I also did not go around telling people to eat shit either, but So pretty soon thereafter, we have this idea of her being telekinetic, and then we have this graffiti, and then we're back to the locker room. So this combination of these kind of scientific things together with news pieces, all of this is adding to the structure, but we do have this kind of through line of this omniscient narrator telling us this story. So we're back to very firmly in the locker room in this paragraph. Girls stretched and writhed under the hot water, squalling, flicking water, squirting white bars of soap from hand to hand. Carrie stood among them stolidly, a frog among swans. She was a chunky girl with pimples on her neck and back and buttocks, her wet hair completely without color. It rested against her face with dispirited sogginess, and she simply stood, head slightly bent, letting the water splat against her flesh and roll off. She looked the part of the sacrificial goat, the constant butt, believer in left-handed monkey wrenches, perpetual foul-up, and she was. She wished forlornly and constantly that you and I had individual, and thus private, showers. They stared. They always stared. So a lot of very interesting stuff is happening. Maybe the least interesting to you, but very interesting to me, is that Stephen King really likes himself an M dash. And M dash is my favorite type of punctuation. It's the long dash, kind of long, it looks like a long hyphen that's connected to the two words on either side. You can use it to set off something for emphasis. You can also use it if you have a sentence that has a lot of phrases that are set off by commas. I love it. The other sort of punctuation thing that may not be something that you're super familiar with is when you have a book like this where there are lots of space breaks, if a space break happens to fall at the bottom of a page, then you usually will have like 3 little asterisks, or in this case, my copy has 3 little dashes. So sometimes I remember a long time ago, before I realized that this is a punctuation thing, I'd be like, why are there like little asterisks in some of these space breaks and not others? And that is simply to alert the reader so that they don't miss the space break when it happens to occur at the bottom of a page. So there's some very sophisticated punctuation happening here. But more importantly, we have this very interesting thing happening with the description of Carrie. I mean, we already know there that like the underdog, we should be aligning ourselves with the underdog. But the way that she is standing, the way that he is describing her, I mean, simply the pimples on her neck and back and buttocks, even the word buttocks, the picture that we are conjuring is so uncomfortable because, there are ways in which, you're sort of repelled from her. I feel bad even saying that. That sounds so like uncharitable. It's so lacking in caritas on my part. All of these descriptions of how she is acting and the things that she is saying and doing, all of them are meant to inspire both sympathy and also to allow the reader to feel a certain amount of the kind of distancing that everyone else in the book is also feeling. The last bit that we're going to look at is here on page 5. We have the entrance of one of the adult figures. It's very interesting to me how the adult figures in this book are equally culpable in lots of ways. And there's a lot made of the fact that, certainly by Sue Snell, that these are all young kids. And there is, a very clear sense that all of these teenagers are trying to figure out how they are supposed to operate in the world and what is important to them and what lies ahead in their futures. But you also have this sense of the adults as being incredibly flawed. We have this real gamut, and we have a really very deep understanding of lots of different characters of lots of different ages, in part because of the incredible narrative voice. But we have the entrance of one of these highly, flawed adults. Miss Desjardins. Of course, they say Miss Desjardins. I think that's what Sissy SpaceX says. Miss Desjardins, their slim, non-breasted gym teacher, stepped in, craned her neck around briefly, and slapped her hands together once, smartly. What are you waiting for, Carrie? Doom? Bell in 5 minutes. So King is really good at dialogue. There's so much of this that is very revealing of people. And, you have a lot of regionalisms, and you also have dialogue that is revealing a lot without being expository. He's not doing that clunky thing where we're learning a lot about someone because they're like, hey, remember last night when we went and got the blood out of those pigs? It's not that kind of dialogue. It is, in fact, showing us a lot more about who these people are. So one of the little, one of the little reservations that I had about this prose by Stephen King is his use of adverbs. And I'm fairly certain that in On Writing, he talks about how you really should not be relying on adverbs. There are, at least a dozen adverbs throughout this novel that I made a little mark by. I'm just fancying myself Stephen King's, editor. But this idea here is actually working well. She slapped her hands together once, smartly. So I like this idea partly because it's a little bit of a throwback to the 50s and 60s, the idea of dressing smart, you look smart. That to me is kind of a nice evocation of a region and of a time. And also there's something about smartly that is in fact it's almost like an onomatopoeia kind of a thing here. And also, it's an excellent gesture. The PE coach, I think non-breasted is actually very funny in some ways. So she comes in and she slaps her hands together smartly. And also the slapping sound, the P and the S, all of this is working very, very well for me. And then this line of dialogue, like so much of his dialogue, is so excellent. What are you waiting for, Carrie? Doom? Which, wow, I mean, that is some foreshadowing right there. As the reader, you're like, ooh, in fact, Miss Desjardins, you better be watching yourself. But this idea of foreshadowing a certain amount of doom is really excellent. But also the fact that this is not a situation where the teachers, at least at this point, where the teachers are protecting her. No one is protecting her. And again, we have adults and we have young people in this novel, and everyone is being terrible. And lots of people have, some amount of contrition and compunction about it. So right at the beginning, we have this idea wow, she is not protected by her mother. She is not protected by her teachers. Everyone here is flawed. And it's really important that we do have this sense of everybody being flawed because, in fact, that allows for a much more interesting exploration of humankind and of how this community is going to operate. It's so good. Also, Bell in 5 minutes is so evocative of what we are doing here. We're reminding ourselves of time. It's nice that we have this idea of the bell in the beginning, and then at the very end of the novel, we of course have the bell ringing that in fact means that the entire town is combusting. One of the things that King does so well that we're not going to be looking at particularly closely is in each of these, not each, but in some of these snippets, whether it is from Sue Snell's book that she's eventually going to write, or whether it's from, that long academic piece about telekinesis, whatever it is, or if it's from the White Report, which is about, all of these proceedings and sort of getting to the bottom of what actually happened on that prom night, which is the name of section 2. All of these different things are giving us different pieces of information that are adding to the tension. So at one point, there's that line very early on that says they did not know she was telekinetic. Then later, there's a line about how, the fact that 200 people died was, startling or whatever. And you're like, oh my God, 200 people. Or the idea of the entire town being obliterated. We get these little teasers early on that really keep us turning pages because because we may know the whole town is going to sort of combust, but we want to know how, in fact, that is going to happen. It's so good. So just to recap quickly about these first couple of pages, everything is here. We've got this highly, nimble narrator who is including both this omniscient, all-knowing, sort of wise voice that is telling us the through line of the story. And then we have the inclusion of all of these other pieces of evidence. And we also have, this cast of characters that is deeply, deeply flawed. That is the perfect segue into a slightly deeper look into this incredible narrative voice. So on page 15, we have the same kind of omniscient feeling voice, but then we have this kind of surprise entrance of the first person. So at the bottom of 15, this is when back in time in 1966, when the neighbors are all hearing this screaming from the White House. We are left with two unappetizing alternatives to explain this time lag. Either Mrs. White's neighbors on the street did not wish to become involved in a police investigation, or dislike for her had become so strong that they deliberately adopted a wait-and-see attitude. Mrs. Georgia McLaughlin, the only one of the three remaining residents who were on the street at that time and who would talk to me, said that she did not call the police because she thought the screams had something to do with Holy Rollin'. This is so masterful. So first of all, this is an absolute masterclass in sort of iterating all of the themes that he is laying the groundwork with. So this idea of the community, all of these neighbors as being implicated and as, sort of being suspicious and not being helpful and not having come to the rescue of this woman. And this idea of everybody as being culpable is very clear here. And then we have Georgia McLaughlin. So again, that's that kind of Irish surname that is speaking to this group of immigrants who are all these working class people who are all living in this town together. The town does really exist. And in her amazing article, Margaret Atwood was talking about how startling it would be if you lived in this town. I think it's called Wakefield, but that is not correct. But if you live in that town and this book comes out in 1974 and the book is taking place in 1979, you'd be like, oh my God, 5 years from now, apparently our town's going to just like combust. But so we have this idea of this community. We're looking at the community. And then just tucked into this paragraph in this very subtle way, we realize that Ms. McLaughlin was one of the three remaining residents who were on the street at that time and who would talk to me. So this me, all of a sudden you're like, oh my gosh, wait, there is a person who's this kind of reporter. There is a person who is in fact assembling all of this information for us, but it's very subtle. And we're already sort of, lulled in and we're already very believing in this narrator. And then suddenly that narrator is making himself known in a way that I find totally irresistible. And I also really love the idea that she thought it was Holy Rollin', because this idea of holy rollers, I mean, that is a phrase that certainly people were using in my childhood for born again Christian types. So that was a little dismissive the way that I just said that. But this idea of a town as being suspicious of her because of her religion, it is very apt, and it really gets to the sort of core of this idea of really hyperbolic evangelical kind of religion as being both suspicious, that people in the town were suspicious of this. And also, in fact, in this book, there's a pretty serious criticism leveled at the kind of, risks and the kind of repercussions that this sort of fanaticism has. The other amazing thing, and we're not going to look too closely at it, is the idea that then this narrator, we have this omniscient feel, and then we also have this first person kind of added element. That same narrator allows itself to go into the minds of a bunch of different people. So we have excerpts from the book that Sue Snell is going to write, but we also have, at times the narrator enters into Tommy's consciousness or into Billy's consciousness. So you have these different characters where we are actually hearing their own language and their own thoughts from them in a way that is so revealing and so important. We also later on have really incredible use of parentheses. So CARRIE, lots of times it is sort of the thoughts that she is having at the beginning. And then toward the end, we realize, in fact, that she is able to sort of read the minds of people. So this very nimble narrator is very important also in terms of the kind of structure that it allows. So throughout, we have all of these different elements that are combined to sort of make this whole entire picture for the reader. And something that is very important is happening. One is that there's a lot of stuff about science. There's a lot of stuff about physics and the idea of, in fact, a lot of metaphors that have to do with physics, that have to do with telekinesis and the idea of being able to actually move things with your mind, and sort of, like adding a lot of scientific credence to this idea of Carrie's power, of these sort of powers that she is developing in herself. Then there's a whole genetic piece. And this is very interesting because, in fact, it is women who are the ones who are expressing this supposed gene for telekinesis. And there's this long explanation that I actually loved, because I really do love genetics, about hemophilia, and that being sort of this royal thing when you have incest among people and people are marrying their first cousins, that you have a lot of, this character that is this characteristic that is sex-linked. You see it manifesting itself in the young men. So you have a lot of young men with hemophilia in these royal families where they were intermarrying. So then, of course, the assumption that we are meant to make is there's also a lot of intermarrying that is happening in this region, which is why you are seeing, this level of telekinesis. We also, at the very end, see this telekinesis thing cropping up in Tennessee. So you have this idea of King as kind of drawing a parallel in terms of these communities, this kind of, the community, the working class community in Maine, and then also this relatively uneducated community in Tennessee. And we know about the lack of education because of the spelling and the diction in this last letter in the book. That's that kind of nod to, like, it's happening again. It's starting up again. In this case, it was starting up again in Tennessee. But we have this idea of the genetics as manifesting themselves in this community. But what's most interesting to me about that is that these are women who have this power. And again, I would argue that this is another example of the way that King is leaning into the fact that women are powerful. So, he could have just as easily given this power to men, but in fact, he is giving it to a woman. So all of this kind of scientific stuff, I mean, part of me was like, I should probably Google these things and make sure that, like, these papers don't exist. I did not actually do that, partly because I had plenty to say, but also because I was like, I just can't imagine that this stuff is actually, that any of this actually exists. Which, I mean, watch me be wrong. But so we have this idea here of this power as being inherently of a woman. And not only that, but there are a bunch of different points in the text where they talk about how this is a power that is most often seen at the onset of menses. So, when you have a girl who is then becoming a woman, this idea of coming into her womanhood is when she, in fact, would develop this power. I also really liked the way that the genetics and the idea of the science really gave us a certain logic to, gave us a logic, like it's all illogical, but it gave us this kind of parameter. And I was very impressed at the end that Stephen King stuck within that parameter. I mean, Carrie is not just like capable of doing anything she wants with her mind. She has this one power. She can't just suddenly start fires. So in fact, what she has to do is, open all of the gasoline, tank things. And then, at the prom, she has water everywhere. And then she moves the electrical things so that everybody gets electrocuted. I was impressed. He only gave her the one skill. And then there's some very interesting problem solving that he had to do that was very satisfying in order for her to like wreck the whole entire town, but just with this one power. I just thought it was so interesting and so well done. It also, of course, adds this enormous amount of verisimilitude. So verisimilitude comes from like veros, from Latin, and then similitude is this idea of likeness. So it's a likeness of reality. I just, that was right off the top of my brain. I'm not really sure that like my etymology was correct there, but certainly it has to do with making things seem real. And he does a very good job of that because you're like, oh my gosh, well, this came across the AP wire. This is from the Associated Press. So obviously it's real. And then, oh, this came out of the Atlantic, magazine, or this came from Life magazine, or this was a scientific study in, the Journal of the New England Journal of Medicine. I don't actually think he is quoting them, maybe. So we have this incredible sense of verisimilitude. I also really loved the way that he combined those kinds of highly esteemed publications with things like graffiti on a desk or, all sorts of different ephemera that he is finding around town. It just provided this incredibly rich panoply of all of this different sort of evidence that we are putting together to understand what went terribly awry. The last thing I will mention about all of this kind of pseudoscientific stuff, all of that scientific stuff, it's important to step back and say, like, okay, so what? Yes, we, we're more invested in the story because we have all of this, quote unquote evidence. But what's important here, at least in my interpretation today, is that Stephen King is using all of that to convince the reader of the power of women. I'm going back to the woman thing. I mean, all of this is like leading to this fact that women, in fact, at the onset of puberty are capable of this really incredible power. And again, I think that all is going back to this idea. My own personal theory is that he suddenly was, surrounded by wife and daughter and he obviously had a mother before that, but was most closely linked with his brother. He talked at one point, it was very sad, about how he really hated to be away from his brother. And at one point, because they were, enduring such difficult poverty, he and his brother were sort of farmed out for a year to different relatives. There were lots of different things that he had to endure as a child, largely because of poverty and being raised by a single parent in the 50s, that were very difficult for him. So it's a very, there's a real sense of strong women, his wife, his mother, and then he is the father of a daughter. So this idea of the strength of women together with this idea, of course, of the second wave of feminism that is really picking up some steam in the early 70s, all of that is leading him to choose to use scientific information to posit this idea that women, in fact, have this incredible power. Another manifestation of this kind of power of women is not just the scientific stuff that is presented, but also the way that the idea of witchiness. So at one point when Carrie is sort of realizing that she has these powers and she's beginning to be a little bit defiant where her mother is concerned, there's a line about how she's thinking of witches and familiars and really this idea of strong women, this idea of witches, the idea of extraordinary women in an ordinary world. Even just mentioning them is sort of underscoring the way that there's this kind of ancient idea of women as being very powerful and having a certain amount of knowledge and a certain amount of control and power, and whether that's spells or whether that's herbs and concoctions and tinctures and whatnot. These witches had to be controlled. So over time, I think they were celebrated at different times during the course of humankind, but certainly in the United States and certainly in New England, witches were really, really coming under fire. So, you've got the Salem witch trials. All of that is happening right in Massachusetts. We're just one state north, or maybe a state and a half. I think Massachusetts and Maine run into each other. There might be like New Hampshire in between, but just a little sliver of New Hampshire. But you've got this it's the same region where really all the crazy witch stuff went down, meaning the crazy witch hunting. So Stephen King is writing about a community that would have been very leery of women who had power. And certainly a lot of the witchiness and a lot of the witch trials had to do with hormones, and it had to do with women menstruating, and it had to do with women in menopause. And so this idea of Carrie as being kind of witchy is very important. At the end of the novel, on 247, she is described as crone-like. And so the crone, the idea of the crone as being sort of like an old, kind of wizened, but very wise and very powerful woman is another kind of manifestation of witchiness. So throughout, you have this very kind of New England sense of Carrie and of women as being very powerful, but being heavily, heavily persecuted for this idea of being able to do extraordinary things that other people are not capable of. I mean, she's literally a witch. She's able to make all of this stuff happen. She can, curse certain people, essentially, and she can do all of this, in fact, because she has recently come into her womanhood. This is also a good segue into this community of New England. And I want to look at a couple of the different descriptions of New England, because I was wondering if I was reading this with a little pride, a little too much pride about being from California. I am really anti-Puritan. Many of you have heard me say that in lots of different Foxed Page, lectures. But I look at our country and I look at lots of things about repression and shame and men being so dominant. All of that to me really just smacks of Puritanism. I mean, we were founded on all of those concepts, which is just kind of a bummer. Okay, but so I want to look at some of these descriptions of New England. So on page 31, we actually have this woman who was, she is in fact out in California, and whoever our, this first person narrator has gone out and in fact mentions a tape recorder. So we have this idea of how, in fact, this investigator is like going about his business, but he goes to Southern California to talk to her about what had happened in Maine. I'm really just like conflating Massachusetts and Maine. That's probably really not fair. Okay, on page 31, this is the narrator talking about this woman, Ms. Horan. But Ms. Horan still carries the thin, difficult soil of New England somewhere inside her. And when she talks of Carrie White, her face takes on an odd, pinched look that is more like Lovecraft out of Arkham than Kerouac out of Southern Cal. I think Southern Cal is funny. I'm surprised he isn't saying like Frisco. But this idea of Lovecraft, really like hearkening back to this idea of Gothic, difficult, spooky writing instead of this kind of freewheeling California, beatnik kind of moment. But this idea of the thin, difficult soil of New England and the idea of her face having this odd, pinched look. I mean, King is a native New Englander and, still lives in Maine. He has his two homes. One is in Bangor and the other is I don't know where. I just saw the most incredible picture of his house in Bangor. I'll throw that up if you're in, if you're on the YouTube. But so he is someone who certainly knows New England and is drawing this very clear distinction. And the things he's saying, this kind of difficult air and the thin soil, it's feeling very puritanical to me. Okay, and then on page 69, this is the kind of omniscient narrator that really is doing us such a favor because it's this very nimble approach that allows us to look, for example, here at the childhood of Carrie's mother. Margaret White was born and raised in Maughton, a small town which borders Chamberlain and sends its tuition students to Chamberlain's junior and senior high school. Her parents were fairly well-to-do. They owned a prosperous night spot just outside the Maughton town limits called the Jolly Roadhouse. Margaret's father, John Brigham, was killed in a barroom shooting incident in the summer of 1959. So this is interesting. This is kind of like this kind of a jolly, literally it's called the Jolly Roadhouse. Her parents seem like fairly, at least her early childhood seems like relatively happy. Her father, of course, John Brigham, there we have the sort of seeds in some way of this evangelical stuff, is killed, and that's when things start to maybe really go wrong for Margaret. Margaret Brigham, who was then almost 30, began attending fundamentalist prayer meetings. Her mother had become involved with a new man, Harold Allison, whom she later married, and they both wanted Margaret out of the house. So you get this sense, in my opinion, of this kind of latent evangelism that I think comes from the fact that we were a country, and New England in particular, was a country that was set up on this idea of being able to pursue this fairly fanatical religious, belief. So on page 126, we have, I think, one of the most telling and one of the most compelling depictions of this area. And I think in lots of ways it helps us have a little more compassion for all of the characters in this book. Again, no one is particularly, off the hook here. Sue Snell sort of. But in fact, we have a better understanding of why we should have some sympathy for these people. This is from Sue Snell's book. I can understand some of what must have led up to the prom. Awful as it was, I can understand how someone like Billy Nolan could go along, for instance. Chris Hargensen led him by the nose, at least most of the time. His friends were just as easily led by Billy himself. Kenny Garson, who dropped out of high school when he was 18, had a tested third-grade reading level. In the clinical sense, Steve Dayan was little more than an idiot. Some of the others had police records. One of them, Jackie Talbot, was first busted at the age of 9 for stealing hubcaps. If you've got a social worker mentality, you can even regard these people as unfortunate victims. So again, we have this idea here of these people who are not well educated, people who are led astray by the time they're 9 years old into a life of crime, people who are suffering from poverty, people who are really leading difficult lives. And in fact, Margaret Atwood articulates this very nicely in her article about Stephen King, that there is this incredible emphasis throughout the book, but it's also very subtle, on social stratification and the idea of this impoverished working class, and how, no matter how sort of how difficult your life is, there is an impulse to always be, bullying or picking on the person who is suffering more than you are. This idea of trying to sort of raise yourself up by pushing someone else further down. So of course, Carrie would be the person who everybody is sort of kicking because they are already down themselves. And this is a very good articulation because of the poverty, because of the lack of education, because of all of the troubles that this sort of, speaks to, gives us a little more sympathy for these people. What's interesting too to me, though, is the next sentence. So we have this description about how if you are like a social worker, you could actually look at these people as somewhat unfortunate. And then we have this. But what can you say for Chris Hargensen herself? It seems to me from first to last, her one and only object in view was the complete and total destruction of Carrie White. So what's interesting to me here is that she is a woman. So really our villain here is this woman, this other woman, Chris. So, and Chris, of course, you have to think of Chris as Christ, as a Christ figure, which is deeply ironic. This is not someone who is going to redeem anyone. In fact, this is like Chris, this is Christian, this is Christ. This is someone who is bent on someone else's destruction, which is obviously the opposite of most of our sort of ideas of Christianity. But we have this woman, this young woman who is really the villain and the one, she's using all of these boys as kind of puppets, and she is kind of, and interestingly, she also has like this real appetite for sexuality and for sex that I think is, again, a little bit of that Puritan stuff. I think even Stephen King there, because she is the villain and he's pointing her out as someone who is like really turned on by doing all of these dastardly deeds, there is a certain suspicion there, I think, about healthy sexual appetite on the part of Chris Hargensen. Okay, so I'm again underscoring this idea of very powerful woman. Even, we have Carrie, who is very powerful in herself, but also the real villain in the story is also a woman. I want to do two things at the end here. I want to take a very quick look at the prose, and then I want to look at the close of the novel. So this was such a funny experience. It's a very kind of throwaway moment in the story, but I really was struck by how beautifully Stephen King is evoking. Well, it's actually, maybe it's a more important moment than I gave it credit. I was so struck by the beauty of the prose and by how clearly this incredible scene was evoked that I marked it mostly because of the prose, but in fact it is I think a very important moment in the book. On page 122, we have these young women who are getting ready for the prom. And obviously the prom is pivotal. The prom is very loaded. I mean, when you take a step back and look at this idea of, like sort of venturing into man and womanhood and the idea that people are going to be crowned king and queen. And there actually is a lot of rhetoric here about how women in the book, in fact, think that it's very sexist and that it's demeaning to women. And I'm like, well, there are a lot of other more demeaning things. But yes, prom queen is definitely not a great thing to be focusing on at an academic institution as you're about to, head out into the world. But so you have this idea here of the prom as being very loaded, but you also have this kind of beautiful evocation of its preparation. So on page 122, there's a boy named George who is artistic. He had redrawn it in silhouette on a huge 14 by 20 foot canvas flat, numbering the various sections to go with the various chalk hues. Now the committee was patiently coloring it in, like children crawling over a huge page in a giant's coloring book. Still, Sue thought, looking at her hands and forearms, both heavily dusted with pink chalk, it was going to be the prettiest prom ever. Next to her, Helen Shires sat up on her haunches, stretched, and groaned as her back popped. She brushed a hank of hair from her forehead with the back of her hand, leaving a rose-colored smear. How in hell did you talk me into this? So this, I just was so moved, which is so interesting to me. I mean, I think there is a lot happening. I love the color pink. So part of it was I was just like responding to this idea of the pink chalk, but there's a lot of trusting of the reader here. I love the fact I liked the detail in how he was executing this. Again, King gives us this good sense of like exactly what's going on, and you are immediately in the in the experience. So this idea of how he had drawn it in silhouette, and I was like, oh, okay, gosh, got it. Like it's sort of black and white on a huge 14 by 20 foot canvas flat. I don't know what a 14 by 20 foot canvas flat is exactly. I can imagine what it is. But these kinds of terms of art, when someone uses a specific term, like a canvas flat, it's very flattering to the reader because you're like, oh my God, okay, now I practically feel like an expert in set design. But you have this sense of really understanding how this world is working. Then this beautiful simile, there's not a ton of figurative language in Carrie. Some of it's better than other, but I liked this idea. Like children crawling over a huge page in a giant's coloring book. So this was very compelling in part because you could really visualize it, but also because coloring is such a universal experience and it's so soothing. There's that whole like movement with all those adult coloring books, and now there's a lot of adult paint by numbers things happening. But this idea of innocence of children, like Sue at this point, she knows she's not going to the prom, but she still wants it to be lovely. So she has this, so she's like a child. There's this idea of kind of childlike wonder and optimism, which is so beautiful. And then I also was so weirdly struck by this idea. She brushed a hank of hair from her forehead with the back of her hand. It's such a precise gesture, and it's so, you can so easily imagine it. Like, it's so evocative of what is happening. I like the word hank. I like the fact that it's the back of her forehead, and I like the fact that it leaves a rose-colored smear. Again, you have the idea of rose-colored glasses. You have the idea of optimism. You're like, okay, we know things are going to go wrong, but like so far, like for Sue, things seem like they might be going okay. And then we have this part where things get a little heavier, and maybe this is also why the passage felt important to me. They're discussing the fact that Sue's boyfriend is now going to ask Carrie, and Sue says this: "You have to make up your own mind about what we did, Helen. I'm in no position to throw stones." So we have this idea of her reflecting, and this idea of like, she's not going to make anybody else feel bad about having thrown all of the sanitary napkins and tampons at Carrie. I did have a hard time at one point. Stephen King has a description of a tampon stuck in Carrie's pubic hair, and part of me literally was like, we should do that experiment. And also, part of me was like, okay, maybe in the mid 70s, like you have a lot more pubic hair, but like I was little then. I mean, whatever. Like I've had experience with all different kinds of pubic hair. That sounds crazy, but this idea of a tampon being stuck in someone's pubic hair, I was like, I just don't know that that's possible. I was literally like, no, I'm not going to run that experiment. Okay, but this idea of like, Sue here is having a real moment of reflection, and she knows what she has decided. She's not going to put it on anyone else, but there is this kind of reckoning and this idea that like we should, as a community, really reflect upon how much we want to take responsibility for our actions. And then at the very end, there's this beautiful finish, a beautiful close to this section. The late afternoon sunlight, warm as oil and sweet as childhood, slanted through the high, bright gymnasium windows. It's so pretty. You have this idea of the gymnasium. You have the innocence of childhood. I love the idea of the light, the sunlight, warm as oil and sweet as childhood. You could say it's a little mawkish, a little over the top, but it really worked for me. As sweet as childhood and warm as oil, there's something so soothing about that. There's also the idea of like this warm liquid, which, really speaks to a little bit of foreshadowing in the gymnasium, a different kind of liquid, which is going to fall on Carrie. But you have at this point this very sort of beautiful and innocent and warm and literal like rose-colored image that is really very important right at the center of the novel. Like it literally happens at the midpoint of the novel. I just was so struck by how gorgeous that prose is. We are going to take a look now at the close of the novel. I'm essentially just going to read the ending. I've alluded a little bit to where we are going here at the end of the book. And it's a really great sort of like coming together of a lot of the different elements that we have discussed. So I'm just gonna cap it off for you on 289. From My Name is Susan Snell, page 98. This little book is done now. I hope it sells well so I can go someplace where nobody knows me. I want to think things over, decide what I'm going to do between now and the time when my light is carried down that long tunnel into blackness. From the conclusion of the State Investigatory Board of Maine in connection with the events of May 27-28 in Chamberlain, Maine. And so we must conclude that, while an autopsy performed on the subject indicates some cellular changes which may indicate the presence of some paranormal power, we find no reason to believe that a recurrence is likely or even possible. Excerpt from a letter dated May 3rd, 1988, from Amelia Jenks, Royal Knob, Tennessee, to Sandra Jenks, Macon, Georgia. And your little niece is growing like a weed, awful big for only 2. She has blue eyes like her daddy and my blonde hair, but that will probably go dark. Still, she is awfully pretty, and I think sometimes when she's asleep how she looks like our mama. The other day while she was playing in the dirt beside the house, I sneaked around and saw the funniest thing. Annie was playing with her brother's marbles, only they was moving around all by themselves. So clearly, here in Tennessee, we are having another incident of something that just a moment ago the committee said would not ever happen again. Then down at the very end, we have the last paragraph. Well, I must go and do a wash, so give my best to Rich and take care to send us some pictures when you can. Still, our Annie is awful pretty, and her eyes are bright as buttons. I bet she'll be a world beater someday. All my love, Melia. I mean, so the ending here, again, is a perfect example of that kind of little token at the end of these novels where, in fact, we have the sense that this, paranormal stuff, this extraordinary impingement on our ordinary life is, in fact, going to continue. So thank you so much for tuning in today. I hope that this has been as fun for you as it has been for me. I mean, Stephen King, just amazing. And frankly, 50 years ago doesn't seem like that long, maybe because I'm 54. But, seems like Carrie's been around forever. It's been so fun to really dig into this king of horror and to really take a good look at all of the things that he is doing so well and, in fact, why his books are so much more than simply genre and why his fiction, in fact, deserves close reading. So I hope you've gotten a lot out of it and I hope you enjoyed it. Happy reading.